Good evening, everyone. We are rapidly moving to the end of First Samuel and then moving into Second Samuel shortly. But at the end of the book of First Samuel, we find a number of very interesting chapters. Now, this is the beginning of the period after Samuel has died. And so this is a narrative that takes on right after the death of Samuel and after the mourning of Samuel. And in chapter 26, we read of interesting things of how Saul, for the second time, tried to chase him down and tried to kill him. And so each time we see David standing by and refusing to kill Saul because he recognizes Saul as God's Mashiach or God's anointed. And as long as God's anointed remains alive, we find that it is important for us to follow the narrative of uh, how Saul treats David. And so it is important then to realize that as much as Saul each time realizes that David has done right and spared his life, Saul continues to pursue David. And so that is the imagery that I think has left us in chapter 26. Now, in chapter 27, a short chapter, requires us now to follow the narrative to see what is David going to do. Because for the second time, Saul pursued him with 3,000 men. And so David said to himself, now, whenever you say said to himself, this one literally uh, says to his heart. That's how the Hebrew has it. Says to his heart, meaning it is something that he speaks to himself inside, not verbally. And for some reason, it is known and it's recorded. Now, understand that Samuel has died, and whatever we read now is not from the hand of Samuel, but a compilation from later prophets as well. And look at what David says to himself. Now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. What this means is this. Now, the idea of perish means to be captured. This word here actually means be captured. It also means be destroyed. It also means, well, I guess you could say that that Saul will one day, by his hand, bring the ruin of David. I think that would be a way to express it. So David recognizes that one day Saul will find a way to ambush him, to capture him, and to kill him. That is what this statement is saying. And so it says, there is nothing good or nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines. Now, why would that be an issue to Saul? Because when it is outside of Saul's domain or dominion, if you want to call it that way, because Saul is a king of Israel. And if the land is outside the domain or dominion of Israel, Saul will not go in to look for David. And so Saul will then will actually despair. The word despair here now means that he will be desperate and he will not search for me anymore in the territory of Israel. And so if that be the case, then David thinks I would have escaped from his hand. And so this is a plan. This is a plan. Needs to get outside of Saul's dominion. Now, this is important because in this plan, he is forcing himself to get out of the land of Israel. Now, you know that he is the anointed of God as well, next in line to be king after Saul. And yet he has decided that at this point in time, the wise thing to do is not to give Saul another chance of ambushing him, because Saul is getting nearer and nearer. And so he has to get out of Saul's control. Now, in verse 2, we read this. So David arose and crossed over. Now, the word cross over is pass over. This is the word, passed over. Pass over means you have a boundary between Israel and Philistine. And so to pass over would require David to move from here into the domain of the Philistines. And so that was what David actually did. He and the 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Maok, the king of Gath. Now, this one is where I would want us to, I guess, remember what happened in chapter 21 when David first ran over to the Philistine area to Achish, the king of Gath. And let us just quickly pop into 1 Samuel chapter 21. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 21, we read in verse 10, then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. That is who we are reading in chapter 27. Now it says, but the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Now they recognize David as the king of the land of Israel, although Saul is still the king. And so they are having information which we are not privy to. Did they not sing of this one as they dance, say, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And it says, David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, the king of Gath. Now, in this chapter, we find that David then behaved like a madman in front of Achish so that his life can be preserved. Now, we know now that Achish is a mighty king sitting next to the borders of Israel. We come back to 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 3. He now goes to Achish at Gath, and then it says that David dwelled. This word live means to dwell. So David was dwelling with Achish at Gath. Now, Gath is in the Philistines area. He and his men, then we read this interesting Hebrew expression, each with his household, which means that the 600 men had his family with them, right? Had their families with them. Now, David with his two wives, Ahinoam, the one from Jezreel, and Abigail from Carmel, Nabal's widow. Remember in chapter 25, he married two of the wives there. And he had Michal, and I mentioned that Saul treats David as dead and gave Michal away. Now it was told to Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. And so what we read here is that the plan of David had worked. What was that plan? That when he reaches the Philistines area outside the dominion of Saul, Saul would stop looking for him. That's the point. That's the point. In verse 5, then David said to Achish, "If now I have found favor in your sight." Now, let me just again review this. This idea in verse 5 says that if I have found, the word find here or found means to secure, means to acquire. It means that that he has attained. Right? I have found. Now, this word favor is chen, that is grace. Right? That is grace. In your eyes. Now, remember, I had always told everyone that grace is seen from the eyes of the beholder. So is good and evil, including grace. And so this is what David is saying. If I've acquired favor in your eyes, that you can see something good in me, then let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country. Well, the country means in the fields of the Philistines, that I may live there. That is where David is choosing to stay, that is away from Achish. And he gave a very interesting reason for why should your servant live in the royal city with you. Now, the royal city means the city of the kingdom, the city of the kingdom, meaning the king's city. And then David is describing himself as your servant. So he is taking on a humble position in the eyes of Achish, the king of Gath. Now, this is important for us to understand because David is protecting his life. David is not displaying his grandeur. David requires to hide in the Philistines' territory so that Saul will not touch him and that he would not die in the hands of Saul. And he is saying that he wants some privacy. And so he says the servant should not be living with Achish, the king, in his place, the city of the kingdom. I suppose you can call this as the capital, right? As the capital. So Achish gave this place. This place is Ziklag that day. And so what does this mean? It means that Achish sees, how should we say? Achish has grace towards David. Now, this is important because grace is not just a concept. Remember, in the Hebrew culture, or as we read in the Hebrew context, the Orientals, the people who live in that area, they all see things quite the same way. Grace is not an abstract, grace is something very concrete. And so when you see that there is favor or grace, and there is the presence of grace in the eyes of Achish, then there is a concept of giving. And so Achish gave. Now, the idea of gave, you could say that he would bestow or permit, right? He would permit. But that is not as clear. This word really means gifted. He gifted Ziklag to David. And what has happened is Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah until this day. Now, the word belong is actually using a very different word. It's not it's not the concept of a political dominion. The word belong says that it continued to be, right? With that is the word has belonged to. The word belong to literally means and has continued to be with the kings of Judah until this day, because it was gifted to David. But it was never called a city of David. It was a city that was given by Achish to David, and it was included in the dominion of the kings of Judah until this day. What day? The day this was written. All right. And so we recognize that this is written not by Samuel, but by somebody who is after that. And so it's writing to give us a picture of the previous. That's before the time it was written, because it was writing something of the past. And the past was about David being gifted this town of Ziklag by Achish, because Achish has grace upon David. And so grace is very concrete. Grace is not about batting the eye or saying some nice words, but grace is something very concrete. And by Achish extending grace to David, Achish gave Ziklag to David. That is what it means. Verse 7 has a bit of challenge in the translation. Now, the English reads this: the number of days that David lived. The word live is the word sit or dwell. All right, so it's good. He lived in the country. This is also the open field of the Philistine. Now, understand, the Philistine is the perennial enemy of Israel. And yet, David was able to find a sanctuary. I would call it a sanctuary within the ranks of the Philistines, and in this case, Achish, the king of Gath. Now, the problem in the translation is this: a year and 4 months. And so let me just work this out. Now, this word a year is a problem, and the word is here. This word basically is yamim, which is days, right? It's in the plural. Now, yom can mean year as well, can mean, right? In some very specific context, can mean year. But in this case, it means days. And so it would be a few days and 4 months. It's not a year and 4 months. If the word yamim is actually translated, it would be years and 4 months, but it's not. And from the way that we can understand this passage, you would find that if you are able to calculate how long that Saul actually ruled. We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. And we had that same conversation, and this would be 2 years, right? And then we have a lot of controversy because the English translators, apart from the King James, could not agree on 2 years, and they would put there 40 years. And that would be the first time we had trouble struggling with the text. But the text is not ambiguous. The text is quite clear. And so what we are saying is that if you take into account of the days of the ark in Kiryat Yarim, right? You take into the context of how long Samuel was judge before he died. If you take into consideration how long David ruled in Hebron before moving the ark to Jerusalem, all of these will tell us that 4 months is actually correct. And so one of these days when we have time, I'll do the math and show you. But the word a year, I would then say that it is an incorrect translation. And it should be a few days and 4 months. So 4 months plus, right? 4 months plus. And that would be how we would read chapter 27, verse 7. Not a year. It should be just a few days. Verse 28. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. These are 3 Canaanite tribes, for they were the inhabitants of the land from ancient times. Remember, they were there even during the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this was in the land as far as you come to the opening of Shur, as far as the land of Egypt, to the south. To the south. We read in verse 9. Verse 9 says, David would strike the land. Now, what land? The land that had the other tribes that were there. And he did not leave a man or woman alive. This is important. David had to destroy them all. And he took away the cattle. This would be you could say that these would be the small four-legged. The small four-legged. It doesn't have to be sheep. It could be goats as well. And then you find that this is cattle. These are the bigger four-leggeds. And then the donkeys, the camels, and their clothing, the garments. And then after he goes and do this, he would return and he would come to Achish. And then Achish said, where have you gone? Where have you made a raid today? Where have you gone to strip off? And the word strip off is actually a raid. Now the raid in those days is to go and strip of the goods, right? Goods and valuables. Now, in those days, the goods and valuables would be livestock, right? Livestock and clothing and food and stuff like that. And David said, against the Negev of Judah. The Negev of Judah, it is the south, right? Negev is south, the south of Judah. And Judah is from Jerusalem all the way down to the south, to the borders of Egypt. And then it says, to the Negev of the this word would be Yer Eli, right? Yer Eli. And against the south of the Cani, the Canaanites. So Yeram Eli and the south of Judah. So they are. This is all at the southern part of Judah. All in the southern part of Judah. What is David trying to say is he is raiding Israel. And by Israel, this would be the land of Judah, because Judah is part and parcel of Israel. And it is to portray to Achish that he is going after his own people. That's basically it. He's going after his own people. And that's the impression that David is giving to Achish. While in actual fact, he is going after the ancient peoples of the land. In the last two verses, it gives us a background information because David did not leave a man or woman alive to bring to Gath. David never brought a single soul to Gath. Why? Because David doesn't want anyone to say what David had actually done. And so the idea is to prevent them from saying, so David has done this and that. His practice all the time he lived in the country of the Philistines has been against all the enemies of Israel. When in actual fact, he told Achish that David has been going after Israel. And so that is the impression that David has given to Achish. And there is nobody to testify that David has done otherwise. That is the principle that David had taken and has sought sanctuary with Achish. And he is trying to give the impression that David and Israel are no longer friends. That's the impression that David is giving to Achish. Now we come to the last verse, and this is what it says. So Achish believed David. Now, very seldom does the Hebrew use this word believed, right? The idea of belief has to be made upon something that Achish did not see or know. And so he has to take David's word, right? He's taking David's word for it. And so based on that, Achish will have the conclusion that he has surely made himself odious among his people Israel. Now the word odious literally means stink. But in the Hebrew, the word odious means very smelly, right? Very smelly. Now, as a Hebrew expression, that David is a bad smell to Israel. That's basically what it's saying. That that Israel that Israel thinks of David as something that is dead, and it has become something that Israel doesn't want to associate with. And that is the conclusion of Achish. And so in that conclusion, Achish says, therefore, he will become my servant forever. Now, understand the word forever here is olam. It means for a long time. And so that is the impression, so that Achish will continue to allow David to live in Philistine, in Ziklag. And the reason also is to avoid Saul. As long as Saul harbors the hope of killing David, and as long as David is in Philistine land, Saul will never ever come into the land to look for David. And so David's life will depend as much as Achish will believe, have that perception, albeit a wrong perception, but it was a necessary perception to protect the life of David. And with this, we come to the end of chapter 27.